My knee drove straight into the Duke of Ashfurn's groin before I even realized what my body had done. The grand ballroom went silent. Every powdered wig, every jeweled fan, every gloved hand froze mid-air. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the scene like it was the most scandalous thing London had witnessed in a century, and perhaps it was. I stood with my chest heaving, my teeth clenched, my eyes blazing like a woman who had absolutely no regrets. My pearl hairpin had come loose. My gloves were slightly torn. I looked like I had walked through a storm, and I was still standing. The Duke, the infamous, untouchable, feared by half of England Duke Rhett Ashburn, slowly straightened. His jaw tightened. His perfectly pressed coat barely shifted. He looked down at me with those unreadable grey eyes, and then, slowly, impossibly, the corner of his mouth curved upward. "A fierce lady," he said, his voice low and dangerously calm, like thunder that hadn't decided to strike yet. My blood turned to ice and fire at the same time. I had just struck the most powerful man in England. In his most sensitive region. In front of the entire people. And he was smiling. Not with embarrassment. Not with rage. With something far worse. Interest. My mother fainted somewhere behind me. A duchess gasped so hard she choked on her own pearls. Two young lords scrambled out of the Duke's eye line as if standing near me would get them buried alive. But the Duke did not look away from me. Not even once. And that was the moment I understood that I had not escaped anything tonight. I had started something I had absolutely no idea how to finish. Now, do you think the Duke was truly unbothered, or was he already falling right there in that ballroom? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story already has your heart, please hit the subscribe button because trust us, it only gets more intense from here. I did not mean to strike him. That is what I told myself as I stood in the middle of the Ashburn Winter Ball, surrounded by the finest, most judgmental people in all of England, with my knee still trembling from the impact and my heart slamming against my ribs like it wanted to escape my chest entirely. I did not mean to strike him. But I was also not sorry. Let me explain how a perfectly respectable young woman from a perfectly respectable family ends up driving her knee into the groin of the most powerful duke in London on the coldest night of December. It started with my sister. My younger sister, Petra, had been crying for 3 days straight before that ball. Not the soft, delicate kind of crying that well-bred ladies were expected to perform behind lace handkerchiefs. No. Petra cried the way she did everything else, completely, loudly, and without any concern for what the neighbors might think. She cried until her eyes swelled shut and her voice turned raw and her hands shook when she tried to hold her teacup. The reason for her tears was a letter. One single letter, delivered by a rider in Ashburn livery, bearing the Duke's personal seal. Inside it were exactly 4 sentences. I memorized them because Petra made me read them to her 17 times before she finally let me take the paper away. The first sentence informed my sister that the Duke of Ashburn would not be continuing his courtship of her. The second sentence stated that the arrangement their fathers had discussed informally was no longer being considered. The third sentence wished her well in her future endeavors. The fourth sentence, and this was the one that made me set the letter down very carefully so I would not crumple it in my fist, informed her that the Duke expected no further correspondence on the matter. 4 sentences. For 3 months of courtship. For every evening Petra had spent learning his favorite pieces of music just so she could play them when he visited. For every morning she had chosen her words carefully because she knew he valued precision and intelligence. For every letter she had written to him that had been warm and honest and full of a young woman's genuine hope. 4 sentences and a wax seal. Our mother immediately began planning how to spin the situation into something survivable. Our father went very quiet in the way he did when he was furious but had no power to do anything about it. Our aunt, Lady Dovemore, who lived with us and had opinions about absolutely everything, declared that the Duke was a cold and hollow man and that Petra was better off, which made Petra cry harder because she did not feel better off. She felt destroyed. I felt something else entirely. I felt the specific kind of anger that lives in your chest and does not burn hot and loud but instead sits low and steady and patient. The kind of anger that waits. When the invitation to the Ashburn Winter Ball arrived 2 weeks later, our mother nearly combusted with conflicting emotions. Attending would mean facing the Duke. Not attending would signal defeat to every gossip in London, and there were many. After considerable debate involving all 4 women in the household and our father hovering anxiously in the doorway, it was decided that we would attend. Heads high. Expressions serene. Petra would wear her finest and smile until her face ached and give no one the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Petra agreed. She was braver than people gave her credit for. I agreed too. For entirely different reasons. The night of the ball, Ashburn House blazed with candlelight from every window. Carriages lined the street 3 deep. Ladies in their finest moved through the entrance in a river of silk and perfume and carefully managed ambition. I walked in beside Petra and felt the shift in the room almost immediately. Heads turned. Whispers started. People knew. Of course they knew. In London, everyone always knew everything, and they knew it before the ink on the letter had even dried. Petra's chin went up. I reached for her hand and squeezed it once. She squeezed back and let go. She was ready. The Duke of Ashburn was standing near the far end of the room when I first saw him that evening. He was speaking with 2 men I recognized as members of Parliament, one elderly lord named Viscount Hartbury, and another sharp-faced gentleman I later learned was a powerful solicitor named Mr. Croft. Beside them stood a woman I recognized as Countess Belvane, tall and imperious, laughing at something the Duke had just said. He was taller than I remembered from the few times I had seen him during his visits to our home. His shoulders were broader. His expression was exactly what I expected, distant, composed, utterly unbothered by the world around him. He had not yet seen us. I watched Petra's face as she spotted him. Something moved across her expression very quickly, something soft and painful and private, and then she locked it away behind a polished smile and turned to greet Lady Osworth, who had appeared at her elbow with too much enthusiasm and too many questions disguised as sympathy. I turned back toward the Duke. He was still talking to his companions. He laughed at something Countess Belvane said, a short, controlled sound that did not reach his eyes, and I thought about those 4 sentences and the way Petra's hands had shaken over her teacup, and that low, steady anger in my chest shifted slightly. I did not plan what happened next. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I was moving through the crowd, heading toward the refreshment table because I needed something cold to hold and something useful to do with my hands, when the crowd shifted unexpectedly. Someone stepped back without looking. Someone else moved forward sharply. I was suddenly pushed off balance, stumbling sideways, directly into the path of the Duke of Ashburn, who had just turned away from his companions and was walking in the opposite direction with the confident ease of a man who expected the world to part for him. We collided. He was solid in the way that large, immovable things are solid. The impact knocked the breath from me and sent me stumbling hard against him. His hand shot out automatically to catch my arm, which was the only reason I did not fall completely. But in that wild, uncoordinated, breathless moment of losing my balance, my knee came up sharply and connected with him directly, devastatingly, and precisely where no knee should ever connect with a duke. The sound he made was very quiet. Just a short, controlled exhale through his nose. Everything else in the room was not quiet at all. The music stumbled to a stop because the musicians were watching like everyone else. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter faded. The entire glittering, perfumed, powdered gathering of London's finest froze in collective, horrified, absolutely delighted shock. I found my footing and straightened and looked at him. His face had gone very still. His jaw was tight. One hand gripped the back of a nearby chair and his knuckles were white against it, but his expression remained controlled in the way that a man who has spent his entire life mastering himself keeps it controlled even when every nerve in his body is screaming at him. His grey eyes found mine. I did not apologize. Perhaps it was because the breath had not fully returned to me yet. Perhaps it was because the anger in my chest had been sitting there for 2 weeks and had absolutely no intention of forming itself into an apology for any man in England tonight. Perhaps it was because when I looked into those grey eyes I found something I had not expected, something that was not cold dismissal or aristocratic fury. He was looking at me the way a man looks at something that has genuinely surprised him. And from everything I had ever heard, Duke Rhett Ashburn was not a man the world managed to surprise very often. The corner of his mouth moved. "A fierce lady," he said. His voice was low and steady, the kind that does not need to rise in volume because it already carries everywhere it needs to go. It moved through the frozen ballroom air and landed somewhere in my chest that I did not have a name for. My face went hot. My pearl hairpin was hanging loose near my left ear. My gloves had a small tear at the right wrist. I was standing in the middle of the most important social gathering of the season, having just committed an act of accidental but undeniable violence against the Duke of Ashburn, and he was looking at me like I was the most genuinely interesting thing he had encountered all evening. Behind me, my mother made a sound between a gasp and a prayer. I heard Lady Dovemore somewhere to my left say, with enormous satisfaction, the single word, "Good." Countess Belvane stood with her fan frozen halfway to her face. Viscount Hartberry looked as though he might need a chair. Mr. Croft was watching with sharp, curious eyes that missed absolutely nothing. I lifted my chin. "Your Grace," I said. My voice was steady. I was enormously proud of that. "I trust you are uninjured." It was not an apology. It was barely even a proper courtesy. But it was the most I could offer with 2 weeks of fury still sitting in my chest and the memory of Petra's shaking hands still sitting in my hands. His eyes stayed on mine for a moment that lasted considerably longer than was socially acceptable. Then he straightened fully, released the chair, and adjusted his coat with one smooth, unhurried motion as though nothing of any consequence had occurred. "Quite," he said. And then he walked away. I stood there and breathed. The music started again. Conversations restarted, louder and faster than before, full of the particular crackling energy that genuine scandal generates in a room full of people who have been quietly waiting for something worth talking about. I could feel eyes on me from every direction. I could hear my name moving through the gathering in waves, passed from mouth to mouth like something bright and dangerous. Petra appeared at my side. Her eyes were wide. "Constance," she whispered. "What did you just do?" "I have no earthly idea," I whispered back. That was the complete truth. I did not know if I had made everything catastrophically worse. I did not know if I had accidentally declared a kind of war on the most powerful man in England. I did not know why he had smiled instead of erupted. I did not know why the memory of that barely there curve of his mouth was still sitting somewhere in my chest in a way that felt entirely separate from the anger and entirely separate from anything I had a sensible explanation for. What I did know was that the Duke of Ashburn had looked at me, truly looked at me, for the very first time in my existence. And that was the most unsettling thing that had happened all evening. More unsettling than the collision. More unsettling than the silence. More unsettling than anything. Because a man like that did not look at a woman like me and simply walk away. Not really. Not completely. Something had started. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows any sign of it. Deep and certain and impossible to stop. I just did not yet know what it would cost me. The morning after the ball, London talked about nothing else. I knew this because our housemaid Dolly, who was barely 17 and treated information like currency she was always eager to spend, delivered her full report before I had finished my first cup of tea. 3 separate accounts of the incident had already taken shape and were moving through the city with impressive speed. In the first version, I had struck the Duke intentionally after a heated argument that had apparently involved raised voices and a broken glass, neither of which had occurred. In the second version, the collision had been an accident but so severe that the Duke had required assistance leaving the ballroom, which was a complete invention. In the third version, which Dolly delivered with particular relish, I had done it deliberately as an act of revenge on behalf of my sister, looked him straight in the eye while doing it, and said something so cutting that 3 people nearby had needed smelling salts. Not a single version was accurate. But the third had a kind of justice to it that I found quietly satisfying. Petra sat across from me at the breakfast table with shadows beneath her eyes that told me she had not slept. She was turning a piece of toast in her hands without eating it. Our mother had not yet come downstairs. Our father had gone directly to his study with his coffee and closed the door, which was his method of surviving things he could not control. Lady Dovemore sat at the head of the table working through her eggs with serene appetite, occasionally nodding to herself as though privately confirming conclusions she had reached some time ago. Lord Fenwick Grally, who had been standing near the Duke when everything happened, had apparently told 3 separate people at his club that morning that Miss Constance Vera was either the bravest woman in England or the most reckless, and that he genuinely could not decide which. Dolly had this information from the bootblack boy who worked the street outside the club. I was not sure whether to be flattered or alarmed, so I settled on neither and drank my tea. They are saying, Petra said slowly, still turning the toast, that the Duke did not look angry. I set my cup down. Who is saying that? Lady Osworth sent a note this morning. Early. Petra finally put the toast on her plate untouched. She said the Duke stood where you left him for quite a long time after you walked away. That he watched the direction you had gone. That his companions tried to resume conversation with him and he was not particularly present for it. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. That means nothing, I said. Perhaps, Petra said. Or perhaps it means something you are not ready to look at yet. Lady Dovemore made a sound of agreement without looking up from her plate. I did not respond to either of them. I picked up my cup again and looked out the window at the grey December morning and told myself firmly that the Duke's stillness after I walked away was simply the stillness of a proud man recollecting himself after an unexpected humiliation. It meant nothing warmer than that. It could not. The letter arrived before noon. Dolly brought it in with both hands and enormous eyes, because the Ashburn seal was impossible to mistake and everyone in the household recognized it now with the particular wariness of people who had already been hurt by what it contained once before. My mother appeared in the sitting-room doorway before Dolly had even finished announcing it. Petra came quietly down the stairs and stood near the bottom, not entering the room, just present. The letter was not addressed to Petra. It was addressed to me. My mother's face moved through shock, then calculation, then a composed expression that did not fully conceal the calculation underneath. She said nothing. She simply looked at me with her hands clasped in front of her and waited. I took the letter to the window and broke the seal. Inside was not a full letter. It was a card. Heavy cream stock, precise dark handwriting, 4 lines, and I almost laughed at the 4 lines because the man apparently communicated exclusively in sets of 4. It read, Miss Vera. I find myself in the unusual position of owing you a conversation. If you are agreeable, I would call tomorrow at 3. Ashburn. Lady Dovemore appeared at my shoulder and read it without apology. He wants to call, she announced. I can see that, my mother said. On Constance. Not on Petra. The silence that followed was the kind that holds too many feelings for any of them to be spoken directly. I folded the card and looked at Petra, who was still standing at the foot of the stairs with her arms loosely at her sides and her face very carefully composed. "Petra," I said. "Do not," she said quietly. "Do not make this into something about me. It is not. It might be. He might want to explain himself. He might believe approaching you through me is easier than facing you directly. The Duke of Ashburn," Lady Dovemore said with complete certainty, "does not take the easy path on anything. He takes the path that serves him. The question is what he believes Miss Constance represents that serves him now." Petra came fully into the room. She crossed to me and held out her hand, and I gave her the card. She read it herself, slowly, and then handed it back. "Receive him," she said. "Petra. I mean it." Her voice was steady in a way that I knew cost her considerably. "If you send him away, people will say our family is frightened of him. I will not have that. I will not be made small by him a second time." She straightened her shoulders. "Receive him, Constance. But do not be gentle with him simply because of his title." Lady Dovemore raised her teacup with great approval. "I will not," I said. He arrived the following afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock. Not 1 minute before and not 1 minute after, because of course the Duke of Ashburn was precisely on time in the way that powerful men are when they want to establish that their time is the time everything else is measured against. I was in the front drawing room when Dolly announced him. I had chosen the chair farthest from the door deliberately, so he would have to cross the full length of the room to reach me, and I would have those seconds to watch him move and compose myself before he was close enough to read my face clearly. He came through the door and I understood immediately that I had underestimated him, which I suspected was something many people discovered too late. He did not cross the room with the stiff formality of a courtesy call. He moved through it the way he had moved through the ballroom, with an ease that was not arrogance exactly but was something adjacent to it. The ease of a man who has never needed to perform comfort because he has always simply possessed it. In daylight, without the spectacle of the ball surrounding him, he was even harder to look away from. That grey gaze found me the moment he cleared the doorway and did not leave my face as he crossed the room. He stopped a proper distance from my chair and inclined his head. "Miss Vera." "Your Grace." I did not stand. I had decided I would not stand, and I held to that decision even as some deeply trained part of me screamed about protocol. Something moved in his expression. Not offense. Something that sat much closer to amusement, which was somehow more irritating than offense would have been. He took the chair across from mine without waiting to be invited, which told me he was not here to perform deference any more than I was. We looked at each other across the small distance between the chairs. "You said you owed me a conversation," I said, because I was not going to sit in silence while he decided when to begin. "I am here. So is the conversation. You may begin it whenever you are ready." "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not a question. It had the quality of an observation being turned over with genuine interest. "Should I be? Most people are. Most people have more to lose than I do at this point," I said. "I have already struck you in front of half of London. The damage to my reputation is complete. Being afraid of you now would be rather like closing the gate after the horse has gone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was an accident." "Yes. You did not intend it." "No. But I will confess that I did not spend a great deal of time grieving it afterward." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite not one either. "Because of your sister." The air in the room changed. Not dramatically. Just a degree or two cooler. "Yes," I said. My voice stayed level. "Because of my sister." He was quiet again. This time it lasted long enough that I could hear the fire in the grate settling and the faint sound of Dolly almost certainly listening from the hallway. "I handled the matter of Miss Petra poorly," he said. I stared at him. Of all the things I had prepared myself to hear, that had not been among them. Not those words in that order delivered in that particular tone, which was not a performance of regret but sounded instead like a man making a factual admission about something he had examined and found wanting. Poorly, I repeated. The letter was insufficient. The letter was 4 sentences, Your Grace. I am aware. 4 sentences for 3 months of courtship. For a young woman who had every reason to believe the arrangement was progressing. Who had adjusted her life and her expectations accordingly. I know. She cried for 3 days. Something moved across his face at that. Fast and genuine and gone again almost before I could name it. But I had seen it. And whatever it was not indifference. Which confused me more than indifference would have. I did not know that, he said quietly. Would it have changed the letter? He did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind. He looked away from me for the first time since entering the room, toward the window and the grey afternoon beyond it, and his jaw tightened once. The courtship could not continue, he said finally. The reasons are my own. But the manner in which I ended it was wrong. I have known that since the morning I sent the letter. Then why send it that way? He looked back at me. Because I am not accustomed to explaining myself. And because I believed efficiency was kinder than a longer conversation that would only prolong uncertainty for her. I breathed slowly. You were wrong. Yes, he said. I was. The fire crackled. Outside the window, a carriage rolled past on the wet street. I looked at this man, this closed, controlled, quietly devastating man, and tried to find somewhere to put this version of him that fit alongside the version I had constructed from 4 cold sentences and my sister's tears. They did not fit together easily. That was the problem. Why come here? I asked. Why come to me and not to Petra directly? If you wish to apologize, she is the one who deserves to hear it. Because I did not know how she would receive me. And because you, he paused, something working in his expression, are not what I expected. What did you expect? A young woman who would be flustered and grateful for my attention and ask no difficult questions. I almost laughed. I am sorry to disappoint you. You have not disappointed me, he said. And the way he said it, quiet and direct and entirely without decoration, sat in the room like something solid. Like something placed there on purpose and not intended to be moved. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I stood, which meant the visit was ending, and he rose immediately because whatever else he was, he had manners when he chose to use them. I will tell my sister you called, I said. Whether she wishes to receive an apology from you directly is entirely her decision. You will respect whatever she decides. Of course. And Your Grace. I met his eyes. If you ever send anyone in my acquaintance 4 sentences again, accident or not, I make no promises about my knees. The almost smile came back. Fuller this time. Still controlled, still barely there, but undeniably present in a way that did something entirely inconvenient to the steadiness I had been working very hard to maintain for the past 30 minutes. Noted, he said. He left. I stood in the middle of the drawing room and listened to the sound of hooves on the street outside and breathed very carefully and told myself that whatever I was feeling was simply the aftermath of an intense conversation and nothing more. Dolly appeared in the doorway approximately 4 seconds after the front door closed. Well, she said, with the confidence of someone who had heard every word through the wall. He is not what I expected either. Dolly. I am just saying, Miss Constance. You are just going back to your work. She went, but she was smiling, and I turned back to the window so she would not see that I was too, just slightly, just for a moment, in a way I had absolutely no sensible explanation for and no intention of examining closely. Not yet. I did not sleep well that night. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling of my room and listening to the house settle around me and tried to make sense of the afternoon in the same way you try to make sense of a dream that felt too real. The Duke had sat across from me in my own drawing room and admitted he was wrong. He had said it plainly, without decoration, without the kind of elaborate deflection that powerful men usually employed when they did not want to fully own something. He had said it and looked at me while he said it and then left, and now I was lying awake turning the memory of his voice over in my mind like something I had picked up off the ground and was not yet sure whether to keep or throw away. I told myself I was only thinking about it because it had been unexpected. That was all. A man like Rhett Ashburn admitting fault was unusual enough to stick in the mind, the same way any unusual thing does. It did not mean anything beyond that. I said this firmly to myself until I almost believed it, and then I fell into an uneven sleep full of grey eyes and the low, unhurried sound of a voice saying you have not disappointed me, and I woke with my hair loose and my chest unsettled in a way I could not name. Petra was better the next morning. Not healed, because grief of that particular kind does not lift in 2 days, but steadier. She came down to breakfast with her hair properly pinned and her posture straight, and she ate her toast this time instead of only holding it. Our mother watched her with careful, hopeful eyes. Lady Dovemore said nothing, which from her was its own kind of tenderness. I told Petra about the conversation honestly. I left nothing out. She listened with her hands around her teacup and her eyes on the table, and when I finished she was quiet for a long time. He said the courtship could not continue for reasons that were his own, she repeated slowly. Yes. He did not say what those reasons were. No. She looked up at me. Do you believe him? That it was not simply disinterest? I thought about the way his jaw had tightened when I told him she had cried for 3 days. That brief, unguarded motion in his face that had come and gone before I could fully read it. I think, I said carefully, that there is more to it than he has said. I do not think the letter was the whole story. Petra nodded slowly. She looked back at her tea. I do not want to receive him. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But I am glad you did. I am glad someone made him say it to another human face instead of letting him seal it up in a letter and walk away from it cleanly. Lady Dovemore, without looking up from her newspaper, said, exactly right. I reached across the table and put my hand over Petra's. She turned her palm up and held it for a moment, and that was enough. The question of what the Duke wanted with me, beyond that single conversation, might have rested there if Lord Fenwick Grally had not arrived unannounced at 11 o'clock that same morning. Fenwick was one of those men who moved through the world as though it was a stage and he had been cast in the most entertaining role. He was not handsome in the way that made people stop and stare, but he was the kind of man who made a room feel livelier simply by being in it. He had dark eyes that moved quickly and a mouth that was almost always on the edge of some observation, and he had been a friend of my family for years, the sort of easy, undemanding friendship that does not require maintenance and simply persists. He came into the sitting room where I was attempting to read and dropped into the chair across from me without ceremony. You have caused an absolute upheaval, he announced cheerfully. Good morning to you too, Fenwick. No, I mean it, Constance, London is in pieces. The story has taken 7 distinct forms by now. In one of them you have challenged the Duke to a duel. I find that one personally inspiring. There was no duel. There was a collision and an awkward conversation and nothing else. He looked at me in the way he did when he knew there was more and was enjoying the patience of waiting for it. And the call yesterday? Because Ashburn does not call on young women. Not personally, not formally, not for any reason that fits neatly into society's expectations. Yet here he was, his actual carriage, his actual horses, his actual self, on your street. He wanted to address the situation from the ball. The situation, Fenwick repeated. Yes. He travelled to your home in person to address a situation. A man who communicates primarily through 4-sentence letters and expressions of moderate disdain. I set my book down. Were you following his carriage? I was driving past. By coincidence. Several times. He waved a hand. Constance. I have known the Duke for 4 years. We are not close, nobody is truly close with Ashburn, but we move in the same circles and I am not entirely unobservant. I have never seen him look at a woman the way he looked at you in that ballroom after you walked away. The fire crackled. I kept my expression very even. And how was that? I asked, because some traitorous part of me needed to hear it said plainly by someone other than Lady Oswortha's note and Petra's careful observation. Fenwick was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. When he spoke again, the amusement had softened into something more genuine. Like he had just remembered that the world was capable of surprising him. And like he was not entirely sure what to do with that. I picked my book back up. I looked at the words on the page without reading them. It means nothing. He is a powerful man who was not expecting to be humbled in public. It was a novelty. Nothing more. Perhaps, Fenwick said. But I have watched him be publicly humbled before, once by a horse and once by a particularly sharp remark from old Lord Blaine, and he did not stand still afterwards staring at the direction someone had gone. He simply continued. Last night he did not simply continue. I thought you should know. After Fenwick left, I sat in the sitting room and looked at the fire and thought about continuing. About what it meant when a man like Rhett Ashburn did not. 2 days later he sent flowers. Not the elaborate, publicly visible arrangement that men sent when they wanted a gesture to be noticed by the right people. A small bunch of white winter roses wrapped in plain paper, delivered by a boy I had never seen before, with a card that said only, "I hope Miss Petra is well. Ashburn." I read it 3 times. I brought the flowers inside and put them in water and stood looking at them in the kitchen while Dolly watched me with enormous interested eyes. He asked about Miss Petra, I said. He sent them to you, Dolly said. The note is about Petra. The flowers are for you, Dolly said, with the absolute certainty of someone who understood things without needing them explained. She went back to her work and left me standing there with white roses and no good answer. I wrote back. I told myself it was simply courtesy. You received flowers, you acknowledged them. It would have been ruder not to. I kept the note short. I told him Petra was well and that the gesture was appreciated. I did not sign it warmly. I signed it formally, Miss Constance Vera, the way you would sign a letter to an acquaintance, not to someone whose voice you were still hearing in quiet moments. His reply came the following morning. Also short. Also formal. And yet somehow not formal at all. He asked if I walked in the mornings. He said he had taken to walking along the embankment before the city grew too loud, and that if I found myself in that direction I should not hesitate to continue on my way without obligation. It was the strangest, most carefully constructed non-invitation I had ever received in my life. And I had absolutely no sensible reason to do anything with it at all. I went. I told myself I was going because the morning was clear and I had been indoors too long. I told myself I was going because I wanted the air and the sound of the water and had no other particular direction to walk in. I did not tell Petra where I was going because there was nothing to tell. I told Dolly I was walking and she said have a lovely time, Miss Constance, with a composure that did not fool either of us. He was there. Of course he was there. Standing near the railing with his coat collar turned up against the cold, looking out at the grey water with an expression that was quieter than the one he wore in rooms full of people. He turned when he heard my steps on the stone path, and something moved across his face briefly, something that might have been a relief but was gone before I could be certain. Miss Vera, he said. Your Grace, I said. What a coincidence. The corner of his mouth shifted. Indeed. We walked. Not side by side exactly, but close enough that our footsteps fell into an accidental rhythm on the stone. The river moved beside us, grey and wide and indifferent, and the city made its distant noises, and for a long stretch neither of us said anything. It was strange how easy the silence was. I had expected it to feel like a confrontation, the way most of our exchanges did. Instead it felt like something else entirely. Like two people who had not yet admitted to themselves where they were going. "You came," he said finally. "You made it very easy to refuse," I said. "Which made it oddly difficult." "That was intentional," he said, with the particular directness that I was beginning to understand was simply how he spoke when he was not performing. "Why?" He was quiet for a few steps. The water moved below us. "Because I did not want you to feel compelled. I have learned that things people do from compulsion are not the same as things people do from choice." I looked at him from the side. "That is an interesting philosophy for a man of your position. Most men of your title expect compliance and call it choice. Most men of my title," he said, "are not particularly interesting." I almost smiled. I pressed my lips together to stop it. "You are very sure of yourself." "I am sure of very few things," he said. "I am considerably more uncertain than people believe." He paused. "Including this." The word "this" sat between us in the cold morning air and did not explain itself further. I did not ask it to. I was not ready to ask it to. But I felt it, a small, specific warmth in the middle of the cold, and I pulled my coat a little tighter and kept walking beside him and told myself I would examine it later, when I was home, when there was distance between me and the quiet devastation of being near him. Later, alone, I would admit to myself that examining it did not help. That distance did not make it smaller. That somewhere between the ballroom and the embankment, something had been set in motion that I did not know how to stop and was no longer entirely sure I wanted to. The problem with wanting something you have no business wanting is that it does not stay neatly where you put it. I tried. I was methodical about it. Every morning I reminded myself of the facts. He had ended my sister's courtship in 4 cold sentences. He was a duke, unreachable in any real sense by a woman of my particular social position, which was respectable but not remarkable. He was closed and controlled and had spent 20 years building walls high enough that most people never bothered to try and see over them. He was not for me. He was not for anyone, really. He was the Duke of Ashburn and he existed at a remove from ordinary human attachment that was practically architectural. And yet he had walked beside me along the river and said I am uncertain about considerably more than people believe, and something in my chest had rearranged itself quietly, the way furniture shifts in the night when a house settles, and now nothing sat quite where it had before. He sent a note the following Thursday. Not flowers this time. Just a single line asking if I was free on Saturday afternoon and if I had any interest in the exhibition at the Royal Academy that was drawing considerable crowds and considerable opinions. I showed it to Lady Dovemore because I trusted her judgment more than my own in matters where my own judgment had developed an inconvenient bias. She read it once and handed it back. "He is courting you," she said. "He has not said anything of the kind." "He does not say anything directly," she said. "That is his specific problem. But a duke asking a young woman to an exhibition is not a research project, Constance. He is courting you. The question is whether you intend to be courted." I sat with that question for 2 days. I talked to no one else about it because talking to anyone else meant talking to my mother, who would immediately begin calculating outcomes, or to Petra, who deserved not to have this dropped at her feet before I had sorted it myself. Petra found me anyway. She came to my room on Friday evening and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at me with those eyes that saw everything. "You are thinking about him," she said. "Not a question." "I am trying not to." "That is the same thing, only louder." She tucked one foot beneath her. "Constance. Tell me. So I told her. Everything. The walk along the river, what he had said, the note about the exhibition. I told her about the shift in my chest that I had not been able to shift back. I told her I did not know what to do with any of it because she was my sister and he had hurt her, and that was not something I could simply set down and step over. Petra listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she looked at the window for a long moment. He hurt me, she said finally. That is true, and I will not pretend it is not. But I have had time to think since his call, and what I keep returning to is what you said about his reasons being his own. That there was more to the letter than 4 sentences. She paused. I do not think he discarded me because I was nothing to him. I think something stopped him and he handled the stopping very badly. Those are not the same thing. Petra. I do not say this so that you will feel better about wanting him, she said, and her voice was steady and honest and hurt, all at once. I say it because it is true and because I am not a reason for you to close a door you might one day regret. I will not be used as a wall you hide behind. If you want to go to the exhibition, then go. I crossed the room and sat beside her and leaned my shoulder into hers. She leaned back. You are braver than me, I said. I am absolutely not, she said. I simply have no choice about the things I have already lost. You still have a choice about this one. I went to the exhibition. He was waiting outside the academy's entrance with his hat in his hands and an expression of such carefully maintained composure that I could see the effort it was costing him, and something about that, about the gap between the controlled surface and the effort underneath, made everything feel suddenly very human and very real. He fell into step beside me as we went inside. The galleries were busy, full of the particular kind of people who came to look at art and be seen looking at it. Several heads turned as we entered together. I saw the recognition move through the room. People took note. In this city, people always took note. I thought about what that meant. About what being seen here with him might stir up. About the conversations that would start over dinner tables that evening, the names that would be linked, the speculation that would begin its slow, unstoppable circulation through every drawing room in London. I walked beside him anyway. We stood in front of a large landscape painting, all dark hills and light-torn sky, and he said nothing for a while. Then he said quietly, "My mother loved paintings like this. Anything with light breaking through something heavy. She said it was the only honest subject in art." I looked at him. He was still looking at the painting. His expression was unguarded in a way I had not seen before, open in the small, private way that people are only when they forget themselves for a moment. "She is gone?" I asked. "When I was 14, he said. "It was quick." Which people always say is a mercy, and perhaps they are right, but it did not feel like one at the time. I did not say I am sorry because it felt too small for 14 years of carrying something that heavy. Instead I said, "What did she think of you?" He finally looked away from the painting and at me. The question had surprised him. She thought I was too serious for my own good. She was probably right about that too. Most mothers are. She wanted me to laugh more. She used to try to make me, with genuinely terrible jokes. She was the worst joke teller I have ever encountered. Something moved across his face that was warm and old and a little painful, the way good memories often are when the person who made them is gone. I laughed anyway. Not at the jokes. At her laughing at her own jokes before she had finished telling them. I watched him say this and felt something open quietly in my chest, like a window in a room that had been closed for a long time. "Your Grace," said a sharp voice behind us. We both turned. Standing a few feet away was a woman I recognized immediately. Countess Belvane, the same woman from the ball, tall and imperious, with a younger man at her side I did not know and a look on her face that was not quite hostility but was precisely calibrated to make me feel the distance between her position and mine. "What a pleasant coincidence," she said, her eyes moving from him to me and back with the practiced ease of someone who had been measuring people's worth at social gatherings for 30 years. "Countess," the Duke said. His voice had returned to its public register, smooth and contained. "You know Miss Vera, I believe." "By reputation," Countess Belvane said. The word reputation landed with a weight that was not accidental. "Most of London does now." She smiled the kind of smile that does not reach anything. "How brave of you to be out and about, my dear. I imagine it has been quite a week." I met her eyes. "It has been an interesting one, yes. I find interesting weeks suit me rather well." A beat of silence. Something like surprise moved through her expression and then compressed itself back down. "Indeed," she said. She looked at the Duke with an expression I could not fully read, something between a warning and an inquiry. "I hope you will both enjoy the exhibition." She moved away, taking the young man with her. The Duke watched her go. Then he said, without turning to look at me, "You did not flinch." Was I supposed to? Most people do. "I have been flinching at things my whole life," I said. "I am becoming rather tired of it." He looked at me then. Full on, the way he did in the ballroom, the way that had started all of this. Grey eyes and that unwavering attention that felt like being the only thing in a room. "So am I," he said. And I knew, with the particular certainty of things felt before they are understood, that he was not talking about Countess Belvane. We stayed in the gallery for another hour. We talked about the paintings and about his mother and about a book I had been reading that he had also read and disagreed with me about in a way that was so immediately engaging I forgot to be careful. We disagreed with the specific pleasure of two people who are equally matched and knew it, and the afternoon moved in the way that good afternoons do, too quickly, without warning. When we finally stepped back out into the cold air, the light had shifted toward evening. He walked me to the street where my waiting carriage stood, and we stopped, and there was a moment that held too many things for either of us to say directly. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For coming." "You could have refused." "I considered it," I said honestly. "I know. That is why I am thanking you." I looked at him in the grey afternoon and thought about his mother and her terrible jokes and the way his face looked when he remembered her laughing. I thought about the walls he had built, the ones everyone mentioned, the ones I had walked up to without meaning to and found myself pressing my hands against without entirely knowing when I had started. "Your Grace," I said. "Whatever this is. Whatever you are doing, and whatever I am doing. I need you to know that Petra matters to me more than any of this. If this becomes something that hurts her further, I will walk away from it without a second thought. I want that to be said plainly." "I understand," he said. And then, quieter, "I would think less of you if it were otherwise." He handed me into the carriage himself, which was entirely unnecessary and entirely deliberate and noted by the driver with great professionalism and by Dolly, who I was informed had been watching from the corner since 3 o'clock, with tremendous satisfaction. I sat in the carriage as it moved through the early evening streets and held my hands in my lap and breathed very slowly and thought that I was in a great deal of trouble. The pleasant, terrifying, completely inconvenient kind of trouble that arrives without knocking and sets down its bags and shows no sign of leaving anytime soon. And the worst part, the part one admitted only to myself in the dark and the rattle of carriage wheels, was that I was not sure I wanted it to leave at all. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it was not from the Duke. It came in a plain envelope with no seal, delivered by hand to our door early in the morning before most of the house was awake. Dolly brought it to me at breakfast with a face that told me she did not know what it contained but sensed that it mattered. I turned it over twice before opening it. Inside was a single page written in a woman's hand. Neat, precise, controlled. The kind of handwriting that had been trained into perfection and then used so long it had forgotten it was trained. The letter was from a woman named Lady Drusilla Ashburn, the Duke's aunt. She introduced herself briefly and without warmth. She wrote that she had heard certain things circulating through the city regarding her nephew and a Miss Constance Vera, and that she wished to be direct. She wrote that the Duke was not a free man in the way that such conversations implied. That there were obligations attached to his name and his title and his family that had been in discussion long before any winter ball or morning walk along any river. She wrote that she bore me no personal ill will and that she was simply doing me the courtesy of clarity before I formed attachments that the situation could not support. She signed it with her full title and no softness whatsoever. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and set it beside my teacup and looked at the wall. Dolly was watching me from the doorway. "Bad news?" she asked. "Information," I said. "I have not yet decided what kind." Lady Dovemore came downstairs 20 minutes later and I gave her the letter without explanation. She read it standing up, which was how she read things she expected to require action. When she finished, she set it on the table and sat down slowly. "Obligations," she said. That is what she wrote. She means a woman. An arrangement of some kind. Something the family has been managing quietly. Lady Dovemore looked at me steadily. "Did he tell you anything about this?" "He told me the reasons for ending Petra's courtship were his own." "Yes," she said. "And now we know what kind of person he is." The kitchen felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago. I picked up my tea and it had gone cold and I drank it anyway because my hands needed something to do. "He was not free," I said. Saying it aloud did not make it better. It made it solid and real and a great deal harder than it had been as a private suspicion in a room full of paintings. "Not entirely free, it seems," Lady Dovemore said. "Though the word obligation covers a considerable range of things. It may not be what you are imagining. It may be worse. You will need to ask him." I did not want to ask him. I wanted to take the letter and place it somewhere I did not have to look at it and continue my orderly, manageable life where the biggest disruption was my sister's heartbreak and not my own. But I had always been a woman who walked toward things rather than away from them, even when the walking was difficult, and I was not about to stop now. I sent a note to the Duke's address that afternoon. Short. I asked if we might speak. I told him there was something I needed to understand and that I would rather hear it from him than from anyone else. He replied within the hour. He asked if I would come to Ashburn House the following morning at 10. He said he would explain everything. I told Petra that evening. Not the full letter, but enough. She listened and then she was quiet for a long time and then she said, "So there is a reason." There was always a reason. She did not say it with bitterness. She said it with the particular tiredness of someone who has already done the work of letting something go and simply feels confirmed in having done it. "Go, Constance. Ask him. You deserve the truth of it." Ashburn House in the morning was a different thing from Ashburn House lit for a winter ball. It was large and quiet, built in the serious grey stone of old money and older expectations. I was shown into a private sitting room that was not the formal kind. It had books in it and a desk with papers pushed to one side and a fire that had been burning long enough to suggest someone had been up for hours. He was standing when I came in. He looked like he had not slept, not dramatically, but there was a tightness around his eyes and a quality of stillness that was different from his usual composure. His usual composure was a choice. This looked like effort. Saturday. He remained standing for a moment and then sat across from me. "You received a letter," he said. "From your aunt?" "Yes. She told me she intended to write." His jaw tightened once. I asked her not to. She did it anyway. She generally does what she believes is necessary regardless of what I ask. "She mentioned obligations," I said. "I would like to know what that means." He looked at me directly, the way he always did, without the evasion that most men used when they did not want to say something. When I was 22, he said, my father arranged an understanding with the family of a Miss Harriet Groin. Not a formal engagement. Nothing signed or publicly announced. But an understanding between two families that when the time came, when her brother came of age and the family finances had stabilized, the match would be made. He paused. My father died 3 years ago. Harriet Groin's brother came of age last spring. The family finances are now stable. The fire crackled. I kept my hands still in my lap. So the understanding is active, I said. It is expected to be honored, he said. By her family. By my aunt, who was involved in the original arrangement. By a significant portion of my father's advisors who view it as a matter of the family's word. And by you. He was quiet. I have not given my word. My father gave his. That is not the same thing, and I have been very clear on that distinction. But the pressure to honor it is considerable and has been growing since last spring. Something clicked into place. That is why you ended Petra's courtship. I had begun to think I could navigate the situation differently, he said. I was wrong. The pressure became impossible to ignore and I ended the courtship before it progressed further. I handled the ending badly. I have already said that. He looked at me steadily. I did not anticipate you. The room was very quiet. Miss Groin, I said carefully. Does she wish for this match? Something shifted in his expression. That is the question nobody else has thought to ask. I am asking. He leaned forward slightly. She does not. She has made that clear to her family repeatedly and been ignored repeatedly. She is 20 years old and has no more power in this than I do, except that her family is considerably less willing to hear her objections than mine is to hear mine. I absorbed this. A young woman I had never met, trapped in an arrangement she had not chosen, powerless in the way that women so often were powerless when the men around them had made decisions on their behalf and called it care. She deserves better than a man who does not want her either, I said. Yes, he said. She does. Then why has this not been resolved? Because resolving it means disappointing people with long memories and considerable influence. Because my aunt believes duty is the highest virtue and that personal feeling is a self-indulgence that men of title cannot afford. He looked at his hands for a moment. And because I have spent most of my life agreeing with her and I am only now understanding what that agreement has cost. I looked at him across the quiet room. This man who had built his walls so high and so solid that he had eventually found himself sealed inside them, conducting himself through life with tremendous efficiency and no real warmth, until a woman with a misdirected knee and 2 weeks of fury in her chest had stumbled into his path and refused to be easily categorized. What do you want? I asked him. Not what your father wanted. Not what your aunt wants. What do you want, Rhett? It was the first time I had used his name. I had not planned it. It arrived because it was the only word that fit the directness of the question. He looked at me with something in his face that was almost painful in its honesty. I want to resolve this arrangement in a way that is fair to Harriet Groin and does not leave her worse off than she began. I want to face my aunt and my father's advisors and tell them that a dead man's informal understanding is not a binding obligation on a living man's life. He paused. And I want to stop walking away from conversations that matter because I am more comfortable with efficiency than with feeling. I held his gaze. That is a great deal of wanting. Yes, he said. It is rather new to me. I stood. Not to leave, but because sitting still suddenly required more composure than I had. I walked to the window and looked out at the grey morning street and breathed. I cannot wait indefinitely, I said. Not harshly. Simply truly. I am not a woman who can be kept in a waiting room while a man sorts through his obligations and decides whether there is space for her at the end of it. I have my own dignity to consider. And I have a sister who has already been managed and set aside once by this situation, and I will not allow anything adjacent to that to happen to me. I know, he said quietly, from behind me. Then you understand that this conversation cannot simply continue as it has been. Yes. I turned around. He was standing now, several feet away, with his hands at his sides and that expression of difficult, genuine openness that I was beginning to understand he almost never showed anyone. Then do something about it, I said. If you mean what you have said, do something. Not for me. For yourself. Because you are a grown man and you are allowed to want your own life. He looked at me for a long moment. You make it sound simple. It is not simple, I said. It is just necessary. I left him standing in that room with the fire and the books and the papers pushed to one side, and I walked out of Ashfern House and into the cold morning, and I did not look back, because looking back had never helped anyone move forward. 3 weeks passed. I did not hear from him. No notes, no flowers, no cards with 4 lines of careful handwriting. The silence sat in the house like a guest nobody had invited and nobody knew how to ask to leave. Dolly stopped mentioning him with elaborate casualness. Lady Dovemore drank her tea and said nothing, which meant she was thinking very hard. Petra asked me once, in the gentle way she had of asking difficult things, whether I was all right, and I told her honestly that I was managing, which was not quite the same thing but was close enough to be getting on with. Fenwick came by on the second Thursday and told me, with less of his usual performance and more of his genuine self, that the Duke had been seen at several private meetings with his family's legal counsel and with 2 of his father's oldest advisers. That there had been a visit to the Groin family seat in Surrey that lasted 3 days. That Lady Drusilla Ashfern had reportedly not spoken to her nephew since and that she had declined 2 consecutive dinner invitations from mutual acquaintances, which was behavior so unlike her that people were paying attention. He is doing it, Fenwick said, not triumphantly, just quietly. Whatever you say to him, he is actually doing it. I nodded and thanked him, and when he left I sat in the drawing room and felt something that was not quite hope and not quite fear but contained elements of both. On the 22nd day, Harriet Groin came to call. I had not expected that. I had not known what to expect, but it was not a small, composed young woman with steady hands and thoughtful eyes who introduced herself at my door and asked, very politely, if she might have a few minutes of my time. I brought her inside. I sent Dolly for tea. We sat across from each other in the same drawing room where the Duke had once sat across from me, and she looked at me with the particular directness of someone who has decided she is done being oblique. I want you to know, she said, that the arrangement is resolved. My family has accepted that it will not proceed. It was not a pleasant 3 days in Surrey, but it is done. She folded her hands in her lap. The Duke was very clear about his reasons and very careful about ensuring my family did not lose face in the resolution. He found an angle that let them call it a mutual decision. He did not have to do that. He could have simply refused and let the chips fall. He spent considerable effort making sure I came out of it without damage. I looked at her. How do you feel about it? She almost smiled. Relieved in a way that I cannot entirely put into words. I have been saying no to this for 2 years and nobody has listened until now. She looked at her hands. I came because I wanted you to know it from me directly. Not from a third account or a rumor. I thought you deserved that. She looked up. He spoke of you. Not elaborately. Just once, when I asked him what had changed. He said he had met someone who reminded him that wanting your own life was not selfishness. That it was simply being honest. After she left, I sat very still in the quiet room and let that settle into me like warmth into cold hands. The knock at the door came an hour later. I knew before Dolly even announced him. Something in the way the house felt, a shift in the quality of the air, the way anticipation has a texture you recognize when you have been waiting for something long enough. He came through the drawing room door and he looked different from every other time I had seen him. Not in his appearance, he was as composed and well-dressed as ever. But there was something in his face that was not the careful mask and was not the rare unguarded moment. It was something quieter and steadier and more permanent than either. The look of a man who had done a hard thing and came out the other side of it and was standing in the place he had been trying to get to for longer than he had admitted to himself. He crossed the room and stopped in front of me and looked at me with those grey eyes that had started all of this, that had looked at me in the ballroom with something that the rest of him had not been ready to name yet. "It is done," he said. "I know." Harriet Groin came. Something moved across his face. She came to you herself. She wanted me to know from her directly. He nodded slowly. She is a remarkable person. She is, I agreed. She deserved better than all of it from the beginning. Yes, he said. She did. And she has said as much to me without softening it, which I respect. I looked at him. And your aunt is not speaking to me. He said it without flinching. That may change in time. It may not. I have made my peace with not knowing yet. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "That cost you something." "Yes," he said simply. "It did. I want you to know that I see that. I am not going to pretend the 3 weeks of silence were easy or that I was not angry for some of them. You were right to be. I know I was." I held his gaze. "But I also see what you did and what it required, and I am not going to let that go unacknowledged." He looked at me with that full, unwavering attention that had terrified me in the beginning and that I understood now was simply how he was with things that mattered to him. Complete. Unheld. "Constance," he said, and my name in his voice was a thing I had not heard before. Not Miss Vera. Not a courtesy. My name. I am not good at this. At any of it. At saying the things that matter rather than managing them quietly from a distance. At allowing people close enough that they can actually reach me. I have spent a long time believing that efficiency was the same as strength, and I have learned, fairly recently and with some discomfort, that they are not remotely the same thing. "No," I said quietly. "They are not. I do not know how to make any promises about being easy," he said. "I can promise to try. I can promise that whatever I say I mean, without decoration or management or 4-sentence letters. I can promise that you will never have to wonder where you stand with me, because I will tell you, even when telling you is the harder thing." He paused. "And I can promise that my knee has developed a deep and sincere respect for you." I laughed. It came out before I could stop it, full and genuine, and the surprise of it on my own face was nothing compared to the surprise of watching him laugh too, an actual laugh, quiet and real and warming his eyes in a way that changed his entire face into something I had not seen before and wanted to keep seeing. Petra appeared in the doorway behind him. She had clearly been listening, because the doorway of the drawing room in our house was not a subtle location and the walls were not particularly thick. She stood with her arms loosely at her sides and looked at him, and he turned, and they faced each other for the first time since the letter. The moment held. "Miss Petra," he said. His voice was careful and genuine and not at all performing. "I handled matters between us very badly and you deserved better. I am sorry. Not as a courtesy. As a fact." Petra looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know you are." She looked at me. Then back at him. "Take care of her. She will argue with you constantly and she will usually be right and it will be enormously good for you." She turned and walked away before either of us could respond, and from somewhere deeper in the house I heard Lady Dovemore say, "Well done, girl," with enormous satisfaction. The Duke looked at me. I looked at him. "Your family," he said, "is not what I expected." "No," I agreed. We rarely are. He reached out and I placed my hand in his, and his fingers closed around it with a steadiness that I felt all the way through me, the way you feel something solid when you have been standing in uncertain ground for a long time and suddenly find your footing. Outside the drawing room window, December had softened into the kind of afternoon that pretended spring was not so far away. The street was quiet. The city moved at its usual distance. Inside the room, the Duke of Ashburn held my hand and I let him, and the thing that had started in a ballroom with an accidental knee and a slowly curving mouth had arrived, finally, at something that felt less like a beginning and more like a return. I had not meant to strike him. But I had never been more glad of anything in my life.